I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The day started like any other, which is to say, with me already earning my keep before Wolfe had even considered the proper temperature of his second cup of espresso. The brownstone hummed with its usual morning rhythm, Fritz humming a tune that probably involved a new pastry recipe, Theodore tending to the orchids in the plant rooms like they were delicate jewels, and me, Archie Goodwin, seated at my desk, ticking off items on the perpetually growing to-do list. The first hint that this particular Tuesday wasn't going to follow the established order arrived not with a bang, but with a rather insistent, high-pitched ringing that wasn't the doorbell. It was the telephone, the one on my desk, and the caller ID was blocked. I picked it up, already mentally bracing for a sales pitch or, worse, a particularly long-winded socialite. "Goodwin," I stated, my voice as neutral as a tax form. A woman's voice, surprisingly calm despite a discernible tremor, spoke. "Is this the office of Nero Wolfe?" "It is. And you're speaking to his assistant, Archie Goodwin. What can I do for you?" "My name is Lena Finch. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent." "Urgent is a relative term, Miss Finch. Mr. Wolfe is currently engaged in matters of great moment, largely botanical. He doesn't take unscheduled calls, especially not from strangers." I watched the kitchen door, half expecting to see Fritz emerge with a new culinary masterpiece, which would, of course, distract Wolfe from anything so mundane as a stranger's urgency. "Please," she insisted, the tremor more pronounced now. "It's about intellectual property, and a threat." I sighed, leaned back in my chair. Intellectual property cases rarely piqued Wolfe's interest unless they involved someone trying to steal his recipes or, even more preposterously, his methods. "A threat to whom, Miss Finch?" "To me. And to my work, my livelihood. It involves a publication, a literary magazine, and, well, I'm afraid someone is trying to ruin me, and perhaps worse." My eyebrows did a small dance. "Ruin you how exactly, and what kind of publication are we talking about?" "The Literary Crucible. I'm the editor-in-chief, or I was. Someone is systematically destroying my reputation, twisting my words, planting slanders, and now they've stolen something vital, something that could implicate me in a scandal I had no part in." Literary Crucible. I'd seen it on newsstands, mostly ignored it. High-minded essays, poetry, literary critiques. Not exactly my preferred evening read, but a legitimate enough enterprise. And a scandal in the hallowed halls of literature? Now, that had a certain flavor, a distinctly non-violent yet potentially poisonous flavor. "And you think Mr. Wolfe can help with this reputation-ruining and scandal-averting?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be a long shot. Wolfe preferred his cases with a more definitive corpse, or at least a tangible object of theft, not a missing reputation. "He's the only one who operates outside the usual circles," she said, her voice dropping slightly as if she were imparting a secret. "He sees things others don't. He values truth and discretion. I need his mind, Mr. Goodwin. My board is moving against me, my career is in tatters, and I fear for my safety." She mentioned safety. That was a small hook. Not a big one, but enough to wiggle an inch. "All right, Miss Finch, I'll pass your proposition to him, but don't hold your breath. Mr. Wolfe's schedule is less a schedule and more a sacred ritual. Can you give me a number where you can be reached?" She provided it, along with a P.S. That sounded more like a desperate plea than an afterthought. "Please tell him I can offer a substantial fee, and that the issue at hand directly impinges upon the very foundation of integrity in the written word." I hung up, rolled my eyes. Integrity in the written word. That might just be the kind of obscure philosophical bait that would get Wolfe to prick up his ears, or at least shift his substantial bulk in his custom-made chair. I stood, stretched, and headed for the office door, ready to interrupt the serene contemplation of rhizomes and report a potential breach in the integrity of breakfast. Wolfe was in the office, naturally behind his desk, peering at the morning paper. His current preoccupation, however, seemed to be not the headlines but the crossword puzzle. Fritz had just placed his second cup of coffee on the small table beside him. "Good morning, sir," he grunted, not looking up. "Archie, you have a lament to present?" Not a lament exactly, more of a literary disturbance. A Miss Lena Finch, editor-in-chief, or formerly so, of the Literary Crucible, claims someone is trying to ruin her reputation, plant slanders, and has stolen something vital. She fears for her safety, and her career is apparently circling the drain. Wolfe filled in a 4-letter word on the puzzle grid with an air of profound accomplishment. "And your interest in this triviality?" "The safety part, mostly, and the substantial fee part, which she mentioned with a certain urgency. Also, she used the phrase integrity in the written word, which I thought might tickle your fancy, seeing as how you occasionally dabble in the composition of prose." He lowered the paper slowly, his eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on me. Integrity in the written word, a rather grand claim for what sounds like a petty squabble among scribblers. "Precisely what I thought, sir," but she sounded genuinely distressed. "And people don't usually call Nero Wolfe for petty squabbles unless the squabble has teeth. Or, in this case, poisoned ink." He picked up his coffee cup, sniffed the aroma with the dedication of a connoisseur, then took a slow sip. "Poisoned ink, you say? A metaphor, I trust, and not a literal ingredient?" "I certainly hope so, sir, unless the literary world has gotten more cutthroat than I imagine." He set the cup down. A long silence followed, broken only by the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I stood there, patient, knowing that Wolfe wasn't just thinking about Lena Finch, but about the implications, the potential disruption, and perhaps most importantly, the intellectual challenge, or the lack thereof. "Have her come," he finally rumbled, his voice a low growl that held no discernible enthusiasm, but also no outright rejection. "At 11, and instruct Fritz to prepare something light for lunch. My metabolism, Archie, is not an infinite resource for digesting the inanities of the world." I hid my smirk. Light lunch. Wolfe rarely had a light lunch, but the have her come part was the important bit. The brownstone's quiet, orchid-scented sanctity was about to be disturbed, and the disruption, I suspected, had just begun. The grandfather clock in the hall hadn't even finished striking 11 when the doorbell rang. I had been stationed at my desk, ostensibly catching up on the bank balance, but mostly keeping one eye on the clock and the other on the door. Wolfe was in his chair, a custom-built fortress of yellow leather that was the only thing in the world capable of supporting his 1/7 of a ton with any degree of dignity. He was currently immersed in a volume of Petrarch, his lips moving just enough to indicate he was tasting the words and finding most of them inadequately seasoned. I went to the door and opened it. Lena Finch didn't look like a woman who dealt in the airy-fairy world of literary critiques and avant-garde poetry. She was mid-40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that said she meant business, even if her business was currently being fed into a paper shredder. Her eyes were sharp, a pale grey that matched her suit, but there were dark circles under them that suggested she hadn't seen a full night's sleep since the last time a Pulitzer was awarded. "Miss Finch, I presume," I said, giving her the smile I usually reserve for people who aren't trying to sell me something or sue me. "Archie Goodwin, come on in. The lion is in his den, and I believe he's finished his morning grumbling." She didn't smile back. She stepped into the hall, her gaze darting around the wood-panelled foyer, as if she expected a critic to jump out from behind the coat rack. I took her coat, high-quality wool, no scent of perfume, just the faint, sharp smell of printer ink and old paper, and led her into the office. Wolfe didn't look up immediately. He finished a paragraph, marked his place with a thin strip of gold-leafed leather, and then slowly, with the deliberate grace of a planet shifting its orbit, inclined his head about 1/8 of an inch. "Miss Finch," he rumbled, "sit. Archie, the red chair." I moved the red leather chair into position. Lena Finch sat, but she didn't relax. She sat on the very edge, her handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, her voice steady but thin, "I appreciate you seeing me. As I told Mr. Goodwin, my situation is precarious." Wolfe crossed his paws over his center of gravity. "Precariousness is the natural state of the human condition, Miss Finch. You mentioned a threat to the foundation of integrity in the written word, a lofty sentiment. It usually precedes a request for me to do something either impossible or incredibly tedious. She didn't flinch. I am the editor-in-chief of the Literary Crucible. For 20 years we have been the gold standard for intellectual discourse. 3 weeks ago, an anonymous column began appearing in various digital trade journals. It's called The Poisoned Pen. It purports to be written by an insider, someone with access to my private correspondence and the magazine's unpublished archives. A gossip monger, Wolfe said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be discussing a fungus on a cattleya. Worse than that, she countered. The columnist is publishing fragments of letters I allegedly wrote, that suggest I've been taking kickbacks from publishers to guarantee favorable reviews. They've also hinted that I suppressed a manuscript by a young writer who later committed suicide because I found his work too competitive with my own circle of friends. None of it is true, but the letters, they look real, they sound like me. And yesterday the physical file containing the original manuscript of that young writer vanished from my locked safe at the office. Wolfe's eyes narrowed just a fraction. This was the subtle trespass I knew would catch him. To Wolfe, a locked safe was a sacred boundary. To have it breached was an insult to the very idea of privacy. "Who has access to this safe?" Wolfe asked. "Myself," she said. "My assistant Marcus Thorne, and the magazine's owner Sterling Vane. But the combination hasn't changed in years. It's an open secret among the senior staff." "And the staff?" I chimed in, leaning against my desk. "How many people are we talking about?" "The core team is small," she replied, looking at me. "Besides Marcus and Sterling, there's Julian Ivey, our senior critic, and Evelyn May, the head of archives. We were a family, Mr. Goodwin, or so I thought. Now the board has given me 48 hours to disprove these allegations or resign. If I resign under this cloud, my career is over. More importantly, the Crucible will be handed over to someone who intends to turn it into a tabloid for the pseudo-intellectual." Wolfe made a sound that was halfway between a sigh and a grunt. "You speak of integrity, yet you admit to a family dynamic that allowed a safe combination to become common knowledge. You have been negligent, Miss Finch." A flush of colour hit her cheeks. "I have been trusting. There is a difference." "Not in this room," Wolfe said dryly. "In this room, trust is a luxury we cannot afford. Archie, I knew the drill." "Yes, sir?" "The Literary Crucible is located on West 43rd Street. Go there, observe the family. Miss Finch will give you an excuse. I want to know who is sweating, who is smiling, and who has recently acquired a taste for expensive ink." Lena Finch looked relieved, but only slightly. "I've told them I'm hiring a consultant to perform an internal audit of our security protocols. You can come in under that guise, Mr. Goodwin." "An auditor," I grinned. "I'll have to sharpen my pencils. It's not as glamorous as being a private eye, but it gets me through the door." "One more thing," Wolfe said, stopping her as she began to rise. "The missing manuscript. What was the title?" Miss Finch paused, a look of genuine sadness crossing her face. "It was called The Architecture of Silence. The author was a boy named David Bale. He was brilliant, Mr. Wolfe, and he's dead because someone wanted to use his work as a weapon against me." Wolfe didn't offer sympathy. He didn't have a permit for it. He simply nodded once. "Archie, see Miss Finch out, then find out everything there is to know about David Bale and his architecture. I find that silence, when architected correctly, usually hides a very loud motive." As I led her back to the front door, the atmosphere in the brownstone felt different. The sanctity Wolfe loved had been breached by proxy. Someone had stolen a dead man's words to kill a living woman's career. It was the kind of intellectual hit and run that made Wolfe's blood boil, even if he never let it rise above room temperature. "He'll take the case," I told her at the door. "He didn't say that," she noted. "He told me to go to your office," I said, opening the door for her. "In Wolfe speak, that's practically a signed contract. Just make sure the coffee is hot when I get there. I have a feeling it's going to be a long afternoon." I watched her walk down the stoop, her shoulders slightly less hunched than when she arrived. Then I went back inside to find Wolfe already back in his book, Though he hadn't turned the page, he was waiting. The West 43rd Street offices of the Literary Crucible were exactly what you'd expect from a publication that considered a semicolon a major life event. The ceilings were high, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and ambition, and the silence was so heavy you could have carved it into blocks and sold it as paperweights. It didn't feel like a workplace, it felt like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of the printed word, where everyone was terrified of being caught committing a typo. I walked in with my briefcase and a look of professional boredom, playing the role of the security auditor, with enough conviction to deceive anyone who wasn't currently committing a felony. Lena Finch had done her part. Marcus Thorne, the assistant she had mentioned, greeted me at the reception desk. He was in his late 20s, wearing a sweater vest that looked like it had been knitted by someone who hated him, and thick-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down a nose that was already too long for his face. He looked like he spent his weekends alphabetizing his spice rack. He shook my hand with a grip that felt like a wilted lettuce leaf and led me toward the inner sanctum. The Crucible's layout was a series of glass-walled cubicles surrounding a central archive, a fortress of filing cabinets and oak shelves. This was where the family lived. Marcus introduced me first to Sterling Vane, the owner. Vane was a man who looked like he'd been manufactured in a factory that specialized in distinguished older gentlemen. He had a mane of silver hair, a silk cravat, and a voice that sounded like it had been cured in sherry for 40 years. He stood behind a desk that was probably worth more than my car, looking at me with the kind of polite condescension usually reserved for a waiter who has brought the wrong vintage. Vane explained that while he supported Miss Finch's desire for an audit, he found the whole thing a bit tedious. To him, the scandal was a gauche intrusion into a world of refined taste. He spoke about the magazine's legacy as if it were a holy relic, and the poisoned pen columns as a smear of mud on a stained glass window. He didn't seem worried about the truth, he was worried about the aesthetics. He was a man who would prefer a beautiful lie to an ugly fact any day of the week, provided the lie was told in perfect iambic pentameter. Next was Julian Ivy, the senior critic. Ivy was perched in a corner office that was so cluttered with books it looked like a structural hazard. He was small, bird-like, and possessed a nervous energy that made him twitch every few seconds. When Marcus introduced us, Ivy didn't even stand up. He was busy scribbling notes in the margin of a manuscript, his pen moving with a frantic scratching sound. Ivy was the one who had the most to say about David Bale, the dead writer. He claimed Bale's work was derivative and emotionally immature, though he admitted the boy had a certain raw, undisciplined energy. When I mentioned the missing manuscript, Ivy's twitching increased. He insisted the theft was likely a publicity stunt by some disgruntled freelancer. He seemed more annoyed by the disruption to his reading schedule than by the potential ruin of his editor-in-chief. He had a way of looking at me as if I were a particularly uninteresting species of beetle. Finally, there was Evelyn May, the head of archives. She was a woman of indeterminate age who wore her grey hair in a bun so tight it seemed to be pulling her eyebrows upward. She was the guardian of the safe, the keeper of the files, and she clearly resented my presence. To Evelyn, an audit was a personal insult to her record-keeping skills. She led me to the archive room, her keys jingling at her waist like a jailer's. She showed me the safe, a heavy, old-fashioned iron box tucked into a corner of the archive. She confirmed that she, Marcus, and Vane knew the combination, but she swore on her collection of first editions that she hadn't touched the Bale file in months. As I watched her, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she pointed out the empty shelf where the architecture of silence should have been. She wasn't just annoyed, she was frightened. Whether she was scared of being blamed or scared of what was in that file, I couldn't tell yet. I spent the next 2 hours auditing. I checked the locks, I looked at the logbooks, and I made a lot of meaningless notes in my pocket diary. Mostly I watched. Marcus Thorne hovered near Lena's office like a loyal, if somewhat pathetic, dog. I watched how Julian Ivy and Sterling Vane avoided each other's eyes in the hallway. I watched the way the staff whispered in the break room, their voices dropping the moment I walked by. By 3 o'clock I had a pretty good layout of the minefield. You had Van, the owner who cared more about prestige than people. You had Ivy, the critic who might have felt threatened by a younger, more talented writer. You had Marcus, the assistant who seemed to know everyone's business but had none of his own. And you had Evelyn, the archivist who treated the files like her children and had just lost one. There was a tension in the air that didn't come from a simple theft. It was the smell of old grudges being dusted off. Someone in this family was the poisoned pen, and they weren't just writing columns, they were dismantling Lena Finch piece by piece, using the ghost of David Bale as their primary tool. I checked my watch. It was almost time to report to the brownstone. Wolfe would be finishing his afternoon session with the orchids soon, and he'd expect a full accounting of every twitch, every cravat, and every nervous tremor I'd witnessed. I closed my notebook, caught Marcus Thorne watching me from across the room, and gave him a cheerful wave that he didn't return. As I walked out into the crisp New York afternoon, I didn't have the missing manuscript, but I had something better. I had 4 people who all looked like they were hiding a secret, and a very strong feeling that the architecture of silence was about to come crashing down. I headed for the subway, ready to give Wolfe the raw material he needed to start building his own structure of truth. The next morning, the brownstone was filled with the smell of Fritz's sourdough and the heavy, expectant silence that always preceded one of Wolfe's cross-examinations of my legwork. Wolfe was at his desk, his fingers tracing the rim of a beer glass, eyes half closed. He wasn't sleeping, he was sorting the sensory data I'd brought back from the literary crucible like a machine grading oranges. I sat at my own desk, my notebook open, waiting for the signal to begin. Archie, he rumbled without opening his eyes. The boy, David Bale, his death was ruled a suicide, corroborate. I flipped a page. I spent my evening at the Gazette digging through the morgue and talking to a few people who don't mind a free drink in exchange for a story. Bale jumped from his apartment window 6 months ago. No note. The police found his place spotless, almost clinical. There was a rumor that every major publication in the city, the Crucible being the final door slammed in his face, rejected him. The Poisoned Pen column claims Lena Finch wrote him a rejection letter so scathing it basically told him to stop breathing and stop writing. But Lena says she never wrote such a letter. She says she liked his work and was planning to publish it. Wolfe opened his eyes. And the manuscript, The Architecture of Silence? I tracked down his former roommate, a guy named Pete Russo who works in a used bookstore in the village. Russo says Bale was obsessed with that manuscript. He called it a blueprint of human deception. According to Russo, Bale believed he'd found a way to prove that most literary success is built on fraud. It wasn't just a story, it was an exposé disguised as a novel. Russo also mentioned something interesting. Bale had a visitor a week before he died. A man, well-dressed, silver hair, smelled like expensive tobacco. Sterling Vane, Wolfe muttered, could be, or someone trying to look like him. But there's a snag. I also went back to the Crucible this morning before the staff arrived and had a little chat with the night watchman, a guy named Saul, not our Saul, but a decent enough fellow who likes cigars. He told me that Evelyn May, the archivist, was in the office late the night the manuscript vanished. She claimed she was catching up on filing, but she left carrying a bulky envelope tucked inside a grocery bag. Wolfe grunted, a sound of mild interest. A grocery bag, the classic amateur conspirator's shroud. What of the assistant, Mr. Thorne? Marcus Thorne is a walking contradiction, I said, leaning back. He plays the part of the bumbling clerk, but I did a little checking on his bank records. Nothing illegal, just some creative inquiry. For a guy on a junior editor's salary, he's making some very large payments to a private clinic in New Jersey. His mother is there. The bills are steep, Wolfe. Steep enough to make a man consider selling a few trade secrets or a stolen manuscript to the highest bidder. And the critic? Mr. Ivy? Julian Ivy is the most fun of the bunch. I followed him to lunch. He didn't go to a fancy bistro. He went to a hole-in-the-wall bar and met with a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of a block of ice. I recognized her, Sarah Gable. She's the editor of the Inkwell, the Crucible's biggest rival. They weren't holding hands, Wolfe. They were arguing over a stack of papers that looked remarkably like galley proofs. If Ivy is feeding material to the competition, he's not just a critic, he's a saboteur. Wolfe sighed, a gust of wind that ruffled the papers on his desk. So we have a patron who visits a desperate author, an archivist with a grocery bag, an assistant with crushing debts, and a critic in bed with the enemy. All of them hovering around a dead man's blueprint of deception. Don't forget the column, I reminded him. The poisoned pen knows things only an insider would know. It quoted a private memo Lena sent to Vane about budget cuts, a memo that never left their 2 offices. Or so she thought. Miss Finch is either a victim of a very coordinated conspiracy, or she is the most inept administrator in the history of letters, Wolfe remarked. Archie, I require more than just observations of their movements. I require their reactions to a specific stimulus. That manuscript is the fulcrum. If it is an exposé, as Mr. Bale's roommate suggests, it contains something that one of these individuals would kill to keep hidden, or perhaps something they would kill to possess. You want me to shake the tree? I asked, already reaching for my hat. No, Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. I want you to plant a seed. Go back to the Crucible. Inform Mr. Thorne, within earshot of the others, that we have located a second copy of the Architecture of Silence. Tell him that a friend of David Bale has offered it to us for verification. Do not be subtle, Archie. Be a nuisance. A nuisance is my middle name, sir, usually right after Goodwin. I also want you to contact Saul Panzer. I need him to shadow Mr. Vane. If Vane visited the boy before he died, he has a personal stake that transcends the mere reputation of his magazine. I want to know where Vane goes when he thinks the world is only looking at his cravat. I stood up, feeling the familiar hum of a case finally moving into the increased pressure phase. Until now it had been all talk and dusty files. Now we were going to tell a room full of people that the ghost they thought they'd laid to rest was about to start talking. As I headed for the door, I looked back at Wolfe. He was already back in his book, but his glass was empty. He didn't ask for another beer. That meant his mind was full. One thing, Wolfe, I said at the door, if there isn't actually a second copy of that manuscript, won't they figure it out pretty quick? Wolfe didn't look up. By the time they realize the copy doesn't exist, Archie, they will have already shown us exactly why they are afraid of it. Fear is the only editor that never misses a subtext. I went to the car thinking about David Bale. The kid had jumped from a window, but he'd left behind a blueprint that was currently making 4 very powerful people very nervous. I wondered if he'd known, as he hit the pavement, that his silence would eventually become the loudest thing in New York. I started the engine, headed for 43rd Street, ready to tell the first of many lies that would lead us to the truth. The seed I had planted at the literary crucible had grown into a jungle faster than a patch of weeds in a vacant lot. I'd spent the morning making sure everyone from Sterling Vane down to the guy who delivered the mail heard the news. Nero Wolfe was about to get his hands on a duplicate of the Bale manuscript. I had delivered the line with just enough conspiratorial zest to make Marcus Thorne drop his stapler and Julian Ivy's eye twitch like a telegraph key. By the time I returned to the brownstone, I felt like a man who had successfully tossed a lit match into a room full of gunpowder and was now just waiting for the boom. The boom, however, didn't come from the suspects. It came from our own walls. When I entered the foyer, the house felt wrong. It wasn't a sound or a smell. It was the absence of the usual afternoon hum. Usually at this hour Fritz would be in the kitchen with the radio low, or I'd hear the rhythmic thud of the elevator as Wolfe descended from his afternoon session with the orchids. Instead, there was a stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I walked into the office, my hand instinctively checking the weight of the .38 in my shoulder holster. Wolfe was already there, seated at his desk. He wasn't reading, he was staring at the small, antique globe that sat on the corner of his desk, his face a mask of granite. He didn't look at me when I entered. "Archie," he said, his voice so low it was practically a vibration in the floorboards. "Look at the centerpiece." I turned toward the small table where Fritz usually kept a rotating display of blossoms from the roof. Today it held a single magnificent Miltonia, an orchid that looked like a pansy on steroids, deep crimson with a white mask. Or rather, it had been magnificent. Someone had taken a pair of kitchen shears and systematically snipped every petal from the stem, leaving a pile of red carnage on the polished wood. But that wasn't the trespass, not the real one. I moved to my desk. The middle drawer, which I always leave locked when I'm out on field work, was a fraction of an inch ajar. I pulled it open. My notebook, the one containing the detailed observations of the suspects and the addresses I'd visited, was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper, the same high-grade linen stationery used by the literary crucible. There was no writing on it, just a dark circular stain in the center. It smelled faintly of almond and iron. "Someone was in here, Wolfe," I said, the blood starting to simmer in my veins. The brownstone was supposed to be a fortress. To have a stranger walk in and prune Wolfe's orchids while rifling through my desk was the ultimate insult. "Fritz?" "Theodore?" "Fritz was at the market for an hour between 2 and 3, Wolfe said, finally shifting his gaze to me. "Theodore was in the potting room with the exhaust fans running. The front door was locked, Archie, yet, as you see, the sanctity of this house has been treated with the casual disregard of a public park." The lock wasn't forced, I noted, examining the door. Either they have a key, which is impossible, or they're a lot better with a tension wrench than any literary editor has a right to be. "It is not the method that concerns me," Wolfe rumbled, his chest expanding as he took a deep, controlled breath. "It is the intent. They did not just steal your notes. They destroyed a living thing to signify their presence. It is a gesture of profound arrogance." I picked up the sheet of paper with the stain. "This isn't ink, Wolfe. I've seen enough to know. This is a chemical compound, probably the same stuff used in old-fashioned fountain pen restoration. It's a signature." "The poisoned pen," Wolfe muttered. "They are no longer content with digital shadows. By entering this house they have shifted the conflict from the abstract to the personal. They believe that by stealing your observations they can stay a step ahead of my deductions." "Well, they're in for a surprise," I said, leaning against the desk. "Most of what was in that notebook is already up here." I tapped my temple. "But it means one of our 4 suspects isn't just a white-collar schemer. They've got the nerve to break into the home of a man who weighs as much as a piano and has a live-in assistant who shoots back." Wolfe's eyes went to the ruined Miltonia again. I knew that look. It was the look he gave a particularly stubborn logic puzzle, or a chef who had dared to overseason the ragout. It was the look of a man who is about to stop being a passive observer and start being a predator. "They think they have silenced us, Archie. They think the architecture of silence is a secret they can guard through intimidation. They are mistaken. This trespass has provided the one element I was lacking, the measure of their desperation." He leaned forward, his bulk straining the springs of his chair. "Contact Saul Panzer immediately. I want him to drop the surveillance on Mr. Vane. If Vane had the nerve to do this, he wouldn't have left such a flamboyant calling card. This was the work of someone who feels small and wants to feel large. Someone who views the world as a series of manuscripts to be edited or deleted." "You think it was the assistant or the critic?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that we are dealing with someone who has spent their entire life in the shadows of other people's brilliance. They have finally written a scene of their own, and they have staged it in my office." He turned his gaze to the window, watching the afternoon light fade over West 35th Street. "Prepare the guest rooms, Archie, and tell Fritz that dinner will be served for 6 tomorrow evening. We are going to invite the family into our parlor. If they wish to play at being house guests, I shall oblige them. But first I want you to find out which of them has a hobby that involves restoring antique writing instruments." That paper stain wasn't just a threat, it was a confession. I felt the tension in the room tighten. The trespass had changed the game. It wasn't about a missing manuscript or a dead boy anymore. It It was about the fact that someone had walked into Nero Wolfe's world and tried to rewrite the rules. "I'll get Saul," I said, "and I'll find the pen." "Do that," Wolfe said, picking up his book again. But he didn't open it, he just held it, his knuckles white against the binding. "And Archie, ensure the beer is chilled. I suspect tomorrow's conversation will be exceptionally dry." By the time the sun hit the brownstone's windows the next morning, the atmosphere was as thick as one of Fritz's reduction sauces. Wolfe had spent the night in a state of glacial fury, which usually meant he ate his breakfast in total silence and spent an extra hour in the plant rooms. The trespass had done more than just annoy him, it had given him a focal point. When Wolfe is merely curious, he is a nuisance. When he is insulted, he is a force of nature. I was at my desk, nursing a cup of coffee and waiting for the phone to ring. I didn't have to wait long. Saul Panzer, the best operative in the business, and the only man Wolfe truly trusted with a delicate trail, called in at 9:15. Saul doesn't waste words, and he doesn't miss details. He had been digging into the intellectual background of our suspects while I was busy playing the auditor. "Archie," Saul's voice was like gravel over silk, "I've got something on our friend Julian Ivy. You mentioned he was arguing with Sarah Gable from the Inkwell. It wasn't about a merger. Ivy has been selling the poisoned pen columns to her for 3 weeks. But here's the kicker, he isn't the author. He's the broker. He's been receiving the copy via a dead drop at a bookstore in the village, the same one where David Bale's roommate works." "A broker?" I leaned back, glancing at Wolfe, who was watching me with the intensity of a hawk over a rabbit hole. "So Ivy is just the middleman. Who's the ghostwriter, Saul?" "That's the beauty of it," Saul replied. "The drafts Ivy has been dropping off aren't typed. They're handwritten in a very specific, old-fashioned script. I managed to get a look at one. The ink is a custom blend, rich, heavy on the iron gall. It matches that stain you described on the paper left in your desk, and I tracked the source of that ink. It's a specialty shop in Midtown. Only 2 people have an active account there. One is a calligraphy professor at Columbia, the other is Evelyn May." I whistled low. "The archivist, the lady who treats files like children, she's the one poisoning the well?" "Maybe," Saul said. "But there's more. I followed Sterling Vane last night. He didn't go home. He went to a private vault in Queens. He spent 2 hours inside a unit registered to a defunct shell company. When he came out, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. I waited until he left and had a look at the facility's ledger. David Bale rented that unit 3 years ago. Vane has been sitting on the boy's primary archives for years, Archie. He didn't just reject the kid, he strip-mined him for ideas." I thanked Saul and hung up, relaying the news to Wolfe. He didn't look surprised. He just sat there, his fingers drummed a slow, rhythmic beat on the arms of his chair. "So," I summarized, "we have Evelyn May providing the venom, Julian Ivy providing the distribution, and Sterling Vane sitting on a hoard of stolen brilliance. It's a regular cooperative of corruption. But where does Assistant Marcus Thorne fit? He's the one with the debt and the dying mother. Mr. Thorne is the catalyst," Wolfe rumbled. "He is the one who discovered the theft of the manuscript, or perhaps the one who realized that his superiors were cannibalizing the work of a dead man. But he lacks the stature to confront them. Archie, the pressure must be increased. The poisoned pen is not merely an act of malice, it is an act of exposure. Someone is trying to burn the house down from the inside, and they are using Miss Finch as the primary fuel." The doorbell rang again. It wasn't a guest this time, it was a delivery. A thick envelope, addressed to Nero Wolfe in a precise, elegant hand. No return address. I checked it for surprises before opening it. Inside was a single photograph and a short note. The photo showed Sterling Vane and David Bale sitting at a cafe, looking very much like a mentor and a protege. The note read, "The architecture is complete. The silence is over. Ask them about the basement." "The basement?" I looked at Wolfe. "The Crucible doesn't have a basement. It's on the 4th floor of a commercial building." "Not the Crucible's basement, Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes sharpening. David Bale's apartment, the room where he lived. You said it was clinical, spotless. A man who writes a blueprint of deception does not leave a clean room unless he has hidden the blueprint elsewhere. Go back there, take Saul. If the poison pen is guiding us, it is because they want the final piece of the puzzle to be found by someone they cannot control. I didn't need a second invitation. I grabbed my coat and was out the door in 30 seconds. The pressure was mounting, not just on the suspects, but on the case itself. We were being led by the nose by a ghostwriter who had invaded the brownstone, and while Wolfe hated being manipulated, he hated an unsolved puzzle even more. As I drove toward the village, I could feel the pieces shifting. Evelyn's ink, Vane's storage unit, Ivy's greed. It was all swirling around the memory of a boy who had jumped to his death. By the time I met Saul at the entrance to Bale's old building, the sun was starting to dip, casting long skeletal shadows across the street. "Ready to go digging?" I asked Saul. "I brought a flashlight and a crowbar," he said with a grim smile. "In this neighborhood, that's standard equipment for a literary critic." We headed down. The basement of the old tenement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and discarded furniture. It took us an hour of searching through the communal storage bins, but tucked behind a rusted boiler we found it, a small fireproof box locked tight. On the lid, etched into the metal, were the words for the editor-in-chief. I didn't open it there. I didn't have to. I knew what was inside. The poisoned pen wasn't a person, it was a legacy, and tonight at dinner Nero Wolfe was going to serve it as the main course. The fireproof box sat on Wolfe's desk like a dormant volcanic rock, heavy with the weight of David Bale's last words. Wolfe didn't touch it. He sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the box as if he could use his sheer mental mass to peer through the steel and read the documents inside. The room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that precedes a hurricane. The office clock ticked with a deliberate, mocking precision, marking the final hours of the family at the literary crucible. I had already made the calls. Under Wolfe's instructions, I had contacted Sterling Vane, Julian Ivy, Marcus Thorne, and Evelyn May. I told them that the audit was complete, and that Mr. Wolfe required their presence for a final summary before his report was submitted to the board of directors. I had been careful to imply to each of them, in a series of whispered, confidential tones, that I had found something that specifically clarified their individual roles. It was the old divide-and-conquer routine, polished to a high shine. By the time I hung up the last receiver, I was fairly certain all 4 of them were currently contemplating whether to flee the country or hire the most expensive lawyers in Manhattan. "The stage is set," I said, leaning against the corner of Wolfe's desk. Vane sounded like he was swallowing a mouthful of gravel. Ivy tried to tell me he had a previous engagement with a French poet, but I told him you'd consider his absence an admission of guilt. He changed his mind. Evelyn May just cried, quietly, which is the worst kind. And Marcus? Marcus asked if he should bring a notepad. He's either the most innocent man in New York or the most cold-blooded. Wolfe shifted his weight, the leather of his chair complaining under the movement. Mr. Thorne's innocence or guilt is secondary to his utility, Archie. He is the observer who allowed himself to be observed. But it is the ink, the iron gall, that remains the most pertinent thread. You have confirmed that Miss May is the only one with the technical knowledge to restore those antique pens? Confirmed, I nodded. But Saul found something else. The shop where she buys her supplies. They also sold a very specific set of glass vials to a Mr. M. Thorne 2 months ago. Vials used for transporting volatile liquids without degradation, like, say, specialized ink. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. A collaboration or a coercion. The archivist provides the tools, the assistant provides the transport, and the critic provides the marketplace. A delightful little syndicate of betrayal. But they are all reacting to the gravity of a larger mass. Sterling Vane is the sun around which these petty planets revolve, and the sun has a storage unit full of stolen goods, I added. What's the play, Wolfe? You have them all come here for dinner. Are we going to feed them or just grill them? We shall do both, Wolfe rumbled. Fritz is preparing a gigot d'agneau. It is a dish that requires patience and a steady heat, much like our current endeavor. But before they arrive, I have one more task for you. I want you to go to the kitchen. Tell Fritz I require the small silver tray, the one we use for correspondence. Place the stain-marked paper from your desk upon it. Beside it, place the photograph Saul recovered from the basement, the one of Mr. Vane and the boy. A little visual aid? A mirror, Wolfe corrected. I want them to see themselves before they hear me. When they enter this room, they must feel that the walls are already closing in. The psychology of the poisoned pen is built on the fear of exposure. I intend to make that exposure absolute. He leaned forward, his face inches from the fireproof box. David Bale wrote about the architecture of silence. He understood that people do not lie with words. They lie with the gaps between them. They lie with what they do not say, what they hide in safes and what they bury in basements. Tonight, I shall fill those gaps. I spent the next hour with Fritz. The brownstone was being transformed into a trap, every detail calculated to unnerve. The lighting in the office was adjusted so that Wolfe would be in the shadows while the red chair was bathed in the glow of the desk lamp. I checked my 38 again, not because I expected a shootout, but because people like Julian Ivy tend to get twitchy when their livelihood starts to evaporate. At exactly 6:30, the first taxi pulled up to the curb. It was Evelyn May. She looked smaller than she had at the office, her coat buttoned up to her chin as if she were trying to disappear inside it. Following her in quick succession were Marcus Thorne, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight, and Julian Ivy, who was frantically polishing his glasses with a silk handkerchief. Sterling Vane arrived last in a chauffeured town car. He stepped out with his silver hair gleaming, his chin held high, the picture of wounded elegance. He walked up the stoop of the brownstone as if he were visiting a junior associate for tea, but I noticed the way his hand hovered near his pocket. I opened the door and ushered them in. The silence in the foyer was heavy, broken only by the muffled sound of Fritz in the kitchen. I led them toward the office where Nero Wolfe sat waiting, a mountain of immovable logic behind a desk that held the secrets of a dead man. "Welcome," I said, my voice echoing in the hall. "Mr. Wolfe is ready for you now. Please, try to keep your voices down. We wouldn't want to disturb the orchids." As they filed into the office, the tension was so thick I could almost taste the iron gall in the air. The trap was sprung. All that was left was for Wolfe to begin the harvest. They sat in a semicircle, a collection of literary elites who suddenly looked like schoolchildren called to the principal's office. Sterling Vane, who attempted to maintain his dignity by crossing his legs and examining his fingernails, occupied the red chair. To his left, Evelyn May was a ghost of a woman, her hands twisted into a knot in her lap. Julian Ivy sat perched on the edge of his seat, his eyes darting toward the bookshelves as if looking for an exit strategy, while Marcus Thorne stood near the door, his face as pale as the stationery he usually handled. Wolfe did not speak for 3 minutes. He sat behind his desk, his eyes closed, his breathing a steady, rhythmic bellows that filled the room. Silence was his first weapon. It forced them to listen to their own heartbeats. On the silver tray between them lay the stained paper and the photograph of Van and David Bale. It was a still life of guilt, and neither could watch it for long. "We are here," Wolfe finally rumbled, his voice cutting through the tension like a dull saw, "to discuss the mechanics of silence, specifically the silence of a young man named David Bale and the clamorous noise you have all made in his wake." "Mr. Wolfe," Vane began, his voice practiced and smooth, "I find this entire theatric display quite unnecessary. If you have found a security flaw in my magazine, state it. There is no need for this atmosphere." Wolfe opened one eye. "The flaw, Mr. Vane, is not in your security. It is in your soul. You are a man of vast appetite and diminishing talent. You realized years ago that the literary crucible was surviving on its history rather than its present. When you met David Bale, you didn't see a protege, you saw a quarry. You saw a boy whose mind was a spring of original thought, a spring you decided to dam and divert into your own parched fields. Vane stiffened. That is an outrageous slander, is it? Wolfe gestured vaguely toward the tray. The photograph suggests a level of intimacy you denied to Miss Finch. And the storage unit in Queens, filled with Bale's drafts and notebooks, suggests a hoard. You didn't reject his work because it was poor. You rejected it so you could possess it entirely. You waited for him to break, and when he did, you stepped in to collect the remains. I did no such thing, Vane hissed, though the silver hair seemed to lose some of its luster. But you were not alone in your scavenging, Wolfe continued, shifting his gaze to Julian Ivy. Mr. Ivy, you are a critic by trade, which means you are an expert at identifying the fingerprints of style. You recognized Bale's voice in Vane's recent editorials. Instead of exposing the fraud, you chose to tax it. You began brokering the poisoned pen columns to the inkwell, using them as a pressure valve to keep Vane under your thumb while lining your pockets. You are not a man of letters, sir, you are a bookkeeper of blackmail. Ivy started to protest, his voice a high-pitched squeak, but Wolfe silenced him with a flick of his finger. And you, Miss May, Wolfe's voice softened, but only slightly. The keeper of the archives. You saw the theft of the manuscript from the safe. You knew Vane had taken it to hide the evidence of his plagiarism. You couldn't stop him, so you did the only thing a librarian knows how to do. You made a record. You provided the iron gall ink, the antique pens, and the internal memos to the one person in that office who still had a shred of conscience. All eyes turned to Marcus Thorne. The assistant didn't move. He didn't blink. Mr. Thorne, Wolfe said, you are the poisoned pen. You didn't do it for money, though your mother's medical bills provided a convenient mask for your activities. You did it because you were David Bale's friend. You watched him wither under Vane's mentorship, and when he died, you realized that the only way to destroy these parasites was to use their own medium against them. You leaked the truth in fragments, building a blueprint of deception that matched the one Bale had described in his final work. Thorne stepped forward, his voice cracking. They killed him, Mr. Wolfe. Not with a knife, but with 1,000 red pens. They told him he was nothing while they were busy stealing everything he was. I wanted them to feel what he felt, the walls closing in, the reputation dissolving. A noble sentiment, Wolfe remarked, delivered with the grace of a vandal. By invading this house and defiling my orchids, you sought to force my hand. You wanted to ensure I wouldn't merely solve a theft, but that I would be provoked into an execution. The room was a vacuum of held breaths. Lena Finch, who had been sitting in the corner, finally spoke. Then the manuscript, the architecture of silence. It was never about me? No, Miss Finch, Wolfe said. You were merely the shield Vane used to hide behind. He allowed the suspicion to fall on you to protect his own masquerade. But the architecture is now complete. Wolfe reached out and placed his hand on the fireproof box. Inside this box is the duplicate manuscript David Bale left in his basement. It is not a novel. It is a detailed log of every idea, every paragraph, and every metaphor Sterling Vane stole from him, dated and cross-referenced. It is a map of a murder by proxy. Vane stood, his face contorted. That box is my property. Bale was under contract. He was under a shadow, Wolfe snapped, his voice booming for the first time. And the shadow has moved. Archie, the phone. Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a confession of grand larceny and a mountain of evidence regarding a criminal conspiracy to defraud. And tell him to bring a very large van. We have a great deal of trash to dispose of. As I reached for the phone, I looked at the group. Vane had collapsed back into the chair, looking ancient. Ivy was weeping. Evelyn May looked relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from her thin shoulders, and Marcus Thorne simply stared at the box, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing again. The verbal deconstruction was over. The truth had been pulled from the silence. For the first time in days, the brownstone felt like it was ours again. The office was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the humidor on the side table. Sterling Vane sat in the red chair, but the man who had walked in looking like a Roman senator now looked like a wax figure left too close to the radiator. His silver hair was disheveled, and the silk cravat that had seemed like a badge of office now looked like a noose. Beside him, Julian Ivy was a huddle of twitching nerves, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. They were waiting for the final blow, and Wolfe, as usual, was in no hurry to deliver it. He enjoyed the weight of the moment, the way the truth settled in the room like dust after a collapse. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked not at Vane, but at the fireproof box. "The irony of your position, Mr. Vane, is that you are undone by the very thing you claim to champion, the permanence of the written word. You believed that by suppressing David Bale's manuscript, you had deleted the man. You treated his mind as a resource to be mined, and his life as a draft to be discarded. But a writer's voice is not so easily stifled. Even in his despair, Mr. Bale was an architect. He designed a structure that would survive his own destruction. It's all circumstantial," Vane rasped, though his voice had no conviction. "A disgruntled assistant and a few old notebooks from a storage unit do not make a crime." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a level of terrifying calm, "the crime is quite specific. Under Section 155 of the Penal Code, the systematic theft of intellectual property through coercion and fraud is a felony. But the legalities are the least of your concerns. You have committed the one sin this office does not pardon. You have used a position of trust to cannibalize the helpless. You didn't just steal his words, you stole his hope, and you did so while posing as his benefactor." Wolfe turned his attention to Marcus Thorne. "And you, Mr. Thorne, your poisoned pen was a clever instrument, but a clumsy one. You sought justice through scandal, forgetting that scandal is a fire that consumes the innocent along with the guilty. You were willing to ruin Miss Finch, a woman who genuinely cared for the boy, simply to ensure that Vane was caught in the backdraft. That is not justice, it is arson." Marcus looked down at his feet. "I didn't see another way. Vane owned the magazine, the lawyers, and the board. No one would have believed a junior assistant over the great Sterling Vane." "Perhaps," Wolfe conceded, "but you underestimated the power of the evidence itself. You see, Mr. Vane, the duplicate manuscript in this box contains something you didn't account for. David Bale knew you were stealing from him. In the final weeks of his life, he began weaving specific, identifiable markers into the prose he gave you, odd metaphors, unique grammatical constructions, and subtle acrostics hidden in the first letters of his paragraphs. These markers appear in every editorial you have published in the Crucible for the last 2 years. They are a digital and physical fingerprint that no amount of editing could erase." I watched Vane's face go from pale to a sickly grey. He knew exactly what Wolfe was talking about. It was a literary DNA test, and he had failed it. "The board of directors," Wolfe continued, "has already been notified, not by me, but by the weight of their own consciences once I provided them with a preliminary outline of these findings this afternoon. They are currently meeting to vote on your immediate removal. But before they can act, Inspector Cramer will be arriving to discuss the matter of the missing manuscript from the safe. Theft, Mr. Vane, is a very loud silence." "And what about me?" Julian Ivy squeaked. I was just trying to survive. The magazine was dying. "You were a parasite on a parasite, Mr. Ivy," Wolfe said with profound distaste. "Your career as a critic is over. No publication will touch a man who brokers stolen secrets to the competition. You will spend the rest of your life reading books you cannot review in a room no one will visit." The sound of a siren drifted in from the street, growing louder as it approached the brownstone. It was the sound of the world finally catching up with the occupants of the red chair. I walked to the window and saw the blue and white lights flashing against the brickwork of West 35th Street. Cramer was early. He must have been sitting round the corner, waiting for my signal. "Archie," Wolfe said, "show them out. Except Mr. Thorne and Miss May, I believe the inspector will want to speak with the primary conspirators. More official setting. Miss Finch, I suggest you stay. There is a magazine to be salvaged, and I believe you have much to discuss with the board." I opened the office door. "All right, gentlemen, the party's over. Mr. Vane, Mr. Ivy, if you'll follow me, the welcoming committee is waiting on the stoop. Try not to trip over your own egos on the way down." Vane stood up, moving like a man in a dream. He didn't look at any of us. He walked out of the office with a hollow, robotic gait, Ivy trailing behind him like a frightened shadow. I saw them into the hall just as the doorbell rang. The heavy, insistent thud that could only be Cramer's fist. As the police took them into custody, the brownstone seemed to exhale. The tension that had been building since Lena Finch's first phone call finally began to dissipate. The family was broken, the thief was caught, and the dead boy's voice had finally been heard. I closed the front door on the noise and the lights, turning back to the quiet of the house. I could hear Wolfe's chair creaking as he adjusted his weight. The case was closed, the exposure was absolute, and justice, in its cold intellectual way, had been served. "Well," I said, walking back into the office, "that's for books, literally." Wolfe didn't answer. He was looking at the fireproof box, his expression unreadable. He had delivered the blow, but he didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had just finished a very dirty, necessary chore. The front door had finally clicked shut behind the last of the investigators and a very shaken Lena Finch. The blue and red strobes that had been dancing across our office walls vanished, replaced by the warm, steady glow of the desk lamps and the comforting, low-level hum of the brownstone's furnace. It was nearly midnight, an hour when the rest of New York was either blurring its troubles with gin or sleeping through them. But in our neck of the woods, it was the hour of the final accounting. Wolfe had not moved from his chair. He sat with his hands resting on his arms, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the fireproof box had been before Cramer's men carried it off as evidence. The ruined Miltonia orchid had been cleared away by Fritz, the polished wood of the side table now gleaming as if the afternoon's carnage had never occurred. But the smell of the room had changed. The sharp, metallic tang of the iron gall ink had faded, replaced by the savory, mouth-watering aroma of the delayed dinner. "Fritz is ready for us," I said, leaning against the door frame. He managed to keep the gigot d'agneau from drying out, though he's been muttering something in French about the police and their lack of respect for a roasting schedule. If we don't move soon, he might go on strike. Wolfe sighed, a deep resonant sound that seemed to vibrate the books on the shelves. "The police, Archie, are blunt. They move through a case like a plough through a flower bed, concerned only with the dirt they can turn up. They see the theft, they see the fraud, but they miss the architecture." "Well, they didn't miss Sterling Vane," I noted. "I haven't seen a man look that hollowed out since we caught that counterfeiter in the Bronx. He wasn't just losing his magazine, he was losing his skin. Without Bale's words to wrap around himself, there isn't much left of him." Wolfe pushed himself up from his chair, a process that involved several stages of gravitational negotiation, and stood for a moment, adjusting his waistcoat. "Vane is a common type, Archie. The world is full of men who believe that because they have the taste to appreciate excellence, they have the right to possess it. They mistake consumption for creation. He thought that by swallowing David Bale, he could become him. It is the ultimate folly of the mediocre." We walked into the dining room where the table was set with the kind of precision that would make a diamond cutter weep. Fritz appeared from the kitchen, his face a mask of professional stoic relief. He carved the lamb with surgical grace, the meat falling away in tender pink slices that smelled of garlic, rosemary, and vindication. For the first 20 minutes we ate in the kind of silence that Wolfe considers mandatory. He doesn't believe in mixing digestion with discourse, especially when the dish is as complex as this one. I watched him navigate the meal, his movements deliberate and appreciative. It was hard to believe that only an hour ago he had been a verbal executioner, dismantling the lives of 4 people with the cold efficiency of a logic gate. Now, his entire universe was the tip of his fork and the flavor of the gravy. When the salad had been cleared and the coffee, black and strong enough to jump-start a locomotive, was served, Wolfe leaned back. He took a slow sip, his eyes drifting toward the window where the city's distant lights flickered. "A poison pen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is a romanticized term for a very ugly thing. Mr. Thorne believed he was a crusader, but he was merely a ghost trying to haunt a house that was already crumbling. He sought to honor his friend by imitating the very vice that killed him, the manipulation of the truth for a private end." "He got them, though," I said, stirring my coffee. "Without those columns, we wouldn't have known where to look." He lit the fuse. "And he very nearly blew up the innocent with the guilty," Wolfe countered. "He treated Miss Finch as a pawn. He treated this house as a stage. He forgot that when one plays with poison, the stains are rarely confined to the target. He is fortunate that I found the architecture more interesting than the trespass. Had he been less clever, I might have been less inclined to see the merit in his motive." "And the boy, David Bale?" Wolfe looked down at his coffee. "A tragedy of the intellect, Archie. He possessed the rare gift of seeing the world as it truly is, a structure of silences and shadows, but he lacked the armor to survive those who would use that vision for profit. He built a glass house and was surprised when the stones began to fly. His only error was in seeking validation from those who could only offer him an appetite." He set his cup down with a sharp click. "Ethics, Archie, are not a matter of public reputation or literary prestige. They are the measure of what a man does when he is alone with his own thoughts and the work of others. Mr. Vane was never alone. He was always crowded by his own vanity." "So back to the orchids tomorrow?" I asked, looking for a way to break the heavy mood. "Theodore said the phalaenopsis are peaking." Wolfe's face softened, the granite of the afternoon finally turning back into flesh and blood. "Tomorrow, Archie, we shall devote ourselves to the genuine. The orchids do not steal each other's colors, nor do they write anonymous columns to disparage the lilies. They simply exist with an integrity that the literary crucible could never hope to emulate." I stood up, feeling the long day finally settling into my bones. "I'll tell Fritz the Lamb was a masterpiece, and I'll make sure the front door is double-bolted. I don't care how many literary ghosts are floating around 43rd Street. I'm not in the mood for any more midnight pruners." Wolfe nodded once, a gesture of dismissal and agreement. "Do that, Archie, and see to it that the bank deposit is made in the morning. Miss Finch's integrity is expensive, and I find that my own appetite for justice is significantly improved by a healthy balance sheet." I headed for the stairs, leaving him there in the quiet dining room, a large man in a large house surrounded by the silence he had so masterfully deconstructed. As I reached the landing, I looked back and saw him taking one last sip of coffee, his silhouette framed against the dark wood of the brownstone. He looked like a man who had put the world back in its proper order, one word at a time. I went to bed thinking that if the pen is truly mightier than the sword, it's probably because Nero Wolfe is the one holding the inkwell,